As I explained a little bit ago, a number of you have expressed an interest in knowing more about the academics who have spoken, and more about how they became involved in the topic, and more about their work on the topic in general, since each of them gave only a particular argument or a particular paper. So what I'm hoping to do is just go down the row and ask each of them to tell us something about their work in this area and how they ended up working on thinking about donor conception. And Ema, you want to start?
Can I ask that you start with yourself as well? Because your work has been referenced quite a bit.
Oh, okay. Well, to some extent, I don't know the answer to the question. That is, I wrote my first paper on this quite a few years ago, and as with most of the things I write, I don't know where the idea came from, except I can say, a young woman who's not here anymore made a really telling comment, I thought, about the fact that most people don't appreciate the privilege of knowing their genetic families because they've always had it. And I think that doesn't apply to me. And it has to do with my family and my experience as a brother and as a son and as a father, that it's always meant a tremendous amount to me. And for some reason, the whole idea of sperm donation always struck me as just bizarre and unintelligible. I couldn't understand how, I just don't get it. And for so many reasons that haven't even been mentioned. That is, I don't understand how you could value your own genetic legacy at $50. And that's the least of it. So also, much of my other philosophical work is about identity formation. And so for me, this was a natural place to go. Okay. Go ahead.
I can start if you want, yeah. I've been conscripted to start. Okay. So I can say that I fell into this topic entirely accidentally. I was a graduate student studying philosophy of science, of all things. I went in to pitch a master's project to the person who became my PhD supervisor, and it was an inane, standard master's about theory change and physics and talking about Kuhn and all sorts of boring things that have been gone over a million times. And she had an article on her desk about gamete provision. So after pitching my project for a master's thesis and it getting accepted, we then sat and argued about that for the following hour. And then she said, "You have a lot to say about that. Why not write about that?" And at that stage, I thought, well, I might not stay in philosophy. This seems interesting. I'm just going to write about that. And that decision has really changed the course. I mean, I left philosophy of science. I went into ethics. I think that the case of procreation is very interesting. Because I think a lot of times in ethics, we think about, questions about consent and harm to other people and making people's lives worse off. And I think that all these core ideas are made really, really much more complex and thus interesting when we look at reproduction, where we have individuals who have the potential to suffer, who have no opportunity to consent to their circumstances. And so I think that it really puts a lot of pressure on some core philosophical ideas. And so that's one thing that makes me very interested in it. Another is, I think technology is moving very quickly, faster than our ability to really thoughtfully think about the consequences of the technology. And so I think it's really important from a very practical point of view to think about this and think about what decisions we should make about how we use this technology. I think we're sort of standing at a precipice of medical technologies as significant, if not more significant, than entering the nuclear age in terms of the amount of serious impact we have the potential to have on other people's lives. And so I think it's really important as ethicists that we think about this and make sure that we make very thoughtful decisions about how we use this technology, because I think if we just sort of let industry do what it likes without trying to stop and think about it, things might end up being very disastrous.
Yeah, okay.
So I have been working on issues. I have been working on issues that relate to reproductive technologies and genetics for over 20 years, 25 years, so a long time. So I have lots of positions on these technologies. I do work both in ethics and philosophy of science, so I'm interested in both how knowledge, scientific knowledge and technological knowledge can either contribute to make societies and people's lives better, and how it can detract from that. So my interest in particular in genetic technologies is because often those technologies are being used in ways that reinforce injustices. Injustices for women, injustices for LGBT, so all kinds of ways. And that it is important to reflect on the ways in which this is the case. And one of my main concerns is that one of the main things that reproductive technologies do, one of the main ideas that they reinforce is the genetic value. And I think that that's problematic for many issues related to many of the things that we have discussed here about who has a right to that and who has the opportunity to parent. So that's the reason my way of approaching these technologies is these technologies can be revolutionary in very good ways, but they are not being used in those revolutionary good ways. So one of the ways to try to move that that transformation, the possibility of transformation of these technologies, because these technologies are not disappearing anytime soon, is to think about what are the ways in which we can use the technologies in ways that can actually further a just world that is good for everybody rather than just for some people.
Yes. Well, as I said to David, is this on? Yeah. When he asked me this question before, it's like, well, I was born and I didn't like it, which is true. It's. I am not suing my parents because they have no money. They were well-intentioned. So I am very moved by the fact that everybody, I think life is a misery and everyone's forced into it. I had kids, so I'm also culpable. So I was very bothered by the lack of consent that everyone has for being born and existing. And for a long time, my intuition was very antinatalist, that it's always wrong to have children, and I thought that was the book I was going to write, but I looked at those arguments. I did not find that they held up. It turns out that lots of people really enjoy life. I don't really get this part, but and I take them at their word. Unlike some people, I don't think they're deluded. I think they have a different point of view. But I've written most of, a lot about procreative ethics generally, and so one of the things that you think about is not just reproductive technologies, but because I think that creating somebody is such a weighty thing to do. You have such a deep responsibility because you're forcing somebody into this miserable life full of risks that you have this deep responsibility to take care of them, and it seemed to me that gamete donors were not doing that. So that's how I got from my general work to that particular issue. Thank you.
So I've been focused on LGBT people and LGBT families, and so I was working on adult relationship recognition before parent-child relationship recognition, and I mean generally driven by the idea that law, this isn't working, that law treats, right, that law treats the heterosexual, gender-differentiated biological family as natural and inevitable, and it's not. And it has produced and funded inequalities based on race and gender and sexuality for a very long time, and based on class. And so trying to look at how to understand models of the family that would treat people in a way that recognize them as full members of the community. And so that has led me to focus a lot on the relationships of parents and children, including in same-sex couple-headed families. And what you find is a lot of their arguments have actually traded on the traction of assisted reproduction in the heterosexual family. And so same-sex couples very smartly made arguments about, well, you're recognizing people as parents who are using assisted reproductive technologies when they're straight and married, so why not recognize us? But I also find in the way that Ema was talking about that the turn to reproductive technologies, including by same-sex couples, also reinforces the salience of the genetic tie, and you find, and for me, that has presents challenges, because I also think part of what's important about an LGBT ethic is this idea of chosen family, and that bonds are not dependent on biological connections. And I worry that we lose that over time, especially the more inclusive the society gets, the less we understand how LGBT people really forged families of choice in the face of exclusion from biological families. So in my own life, I feel this tension, and David knows I'm recently adopted, and my partner and I knew from the outset of our very long relationship that if we were to eventually have a child, it would be through adoption. And so I'm also interested in the relationship between adoption and assisted reproduction, and we did an open adoption, and so I think there's a way in which I'm committed to equality in terms of family formation, and if assisted reproduction is available to people who replicate the traditional family, it should be available on an even-handed basis, but also worry about the ways in which it reinforces the importance of the genetic tie.
So I'm coming from feminist philosophy, and I've also written a lot on marriage and personal relationships, thinking about equality for women, equality for LGBT people, equality for poly people, for asexuals and aromatics, equality for single and unpartnered people. So equality in terms of relationship recognition for people whose lives don't fit the kind of monogamous, marital, romantic, sexual, two-person ideal that our society enshrines. And so one of the questions, one of the issues that led me to thinking about procreative ethics is thinking about, well, if you're outside that kind of sexual, heterosexual family, how does one become a parent, right? And as I said yesterday, I think becoming a parent starts morally with accepting parental obligations, which correlate to children's rights. And so as I started to think through, well, how do we become parents? I think that people who want to become parents can become parents using provided gametes or donated gametes, but that has to be constrained by recognition of children's rights. So as I suggested yesterday, I'm not for abolishing gamete donation practices, but I do think there are a lot of good arguments for reform that have come out in the past couple of days.
Do you want to take questions, or should we just...
Maybe open it.
Yeah, okay. We'll take a few questions.
Okay, I did want to say thank you so very, very much. It has been a truly an enlightening experience. I was actually just having a fantastic conversation. One of the, maybe one of the stereotypes that donors go through, and thank you for the donor's perspective, because oftentimes donors do this out of an altruistic, very meaningful, I want to go ahead and help a family in need, but what they don't think about is the future repercussions, right? Because at 21, 22, quite honestly, the mindset is not yet mature enough to think about long-term repercussions. When I was, 2 years ago, I did my DNA testing, found my donor by triangulating DNA. It's a lot of fun, by the way, if anybody wants to do it. It's very, very interesting. I've always been involved in genetics or research in some fashion, even though I'm a retail major. Who knows? But once finding my donor, he cut off. He answered me questions. He was very generous with his time, gave me an hour of his time, told me that he did not think anything about his deed after the fact, put it to bed, had no idea. His first question to me was, how did you find me? And that's pretty much where we left it. Gave me a little bit of history, like I alluded to yesterday, about being 50% Ashkenazi Jewish, which I found out. I was raised Italian. Imagine how that kind of surprises you. Now, certainly, probably 10 days after I was able to speak to him on the phone and he received an email, I did ask for information regarding his sibling who had the early onset dementia. I received a cease and desist. Painful, to say the least, and Rivka, I thank you so much for that. It was very, very painful, and I'll tell you, being 41 years old, having gone back to the mindset of 16 when I found out that I was donor conceived during those formative years, going back into that moment was, I'm going to use really nice words, it was destructive, to say the least, right? Because you want to know where you come from. You want to know that 50%. But, you know, from a legal standpoint, I got an attorney too, and I understand that I'm not owed anything, but I think about the fact of, you know, the right to know for a donor-conceived person, and I don't think about necessarily my generation. I think about the future generations. I'm concerned that we have this naivety in the world that, you know, just because we're here, we should be thankful to be existing. I think it's crazy. So if anybody has a thought on that, I would love to hear it.
So other questions for the, yes.
Thank you to everyone on the panel, and thank you, Dr. Velleman, for putting this together. A topic that hasn't been brought up that I would like to bring up, particularly vis-a-vis identity formation, is the topic of race and its application in all of the things that we're talking about here. I, for example, was raised in a fully Chinese family, and my donor is Ashkenazi Jewish. And I found out when I was 36 years old that this was the case, although I knew that I was donor conceived starting at 15, but I didn't delve into my DNA until I was 36 and already a parent. So I would like to ask the panel to perhaps share your thoughts on the relationship between race intersectionally with the issues that we've raised over the course of this 2-day period. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to start because I did actually say a few thoughts about race, very kind of starting points at the end of my talk yesterday. So I do think it's concerning. I mean, I've looked at the sperm banks websites where you can choose donors, and one of the main ways you can select is using the criteria of race. Now, I think race is constructed, so I think it's, you know, problematic to be using this you know, as a way to select a donor for many reasons. So there's a worry that people might be choosing what kind of person they want their child to be on the basis of racial stereotypes. There's a worry that using that to choose will actually reinforce racial stereotypes. But yeah, I can also see from what you said, there's also because race is important in our society, right? So this is one of the things that people who write on philosophy of race talk about. Like, on the one hand, many people think race is a construct, but also it's viewed as real by many people in our society. Right, and yeah, and so it has, yeah, so just because it's socially constructed doesn't mean it doesn't have real effects. It doesn't mean in some sense it isn't real, right? So it has real effects, and it matters to people in terms of their identity, in terms of knowing who they are. So that's what I hear you saying, that that's another aspect of race that's important. But yeah, so it
Dysphoria that occurs when there's a disjuncture between the family that you're raised in and the racial identity that you then discover that you are.
Right, yeah, so self-knowledge, self-understanding. But yeah, so I mean, it concerns me, you know, for many different reasons.
I think that it's very similar to adoption cases where people adopt across racial and cultural communities, and where I think people did it with good intentions without thinking that this would make a difference, and some of the children felt like it did make a difference to them. They felt alienated or cut off from their biological culture. So I think it's very similar to adoption cases when you if somebody's using a donated gamete, to think about the same set of issues as they would for adopting across cultural or racial lines.
I mean, I guess I want to distinguish those two things because, so if you followed the recent fight in New York over the surrogacy legislation, there was a letter by Gloria Steinem and the president of the National Organization of Women opposing the legislation, and in part doing so by saying what the turn to surrogacy does is allow gay male couples to opt out of an adoption scheme in which they, in the words of this letter, what they don't want to do is adopt black and brown children, right? And so, I mean, that was the claim against. And so I actually think your situation sounds exceptional to me, whereas what people are actually doing in the market for gametes is reproducing the biological family, which includes which is also usually the monoracial family, but it includes whatever they're trying to replicate in terms of race. And so I think
It's actually not that exceptional within our group.
Yeah.
I think there are at least 5 or 6 others who are in my position who were raised to believe that we were people of color, but then discovered that we were actually half white.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I mean, so there's a woman, Camille Gear-Rich at USC, who's writing about the racial identity practices of gamete banks and showing the ways in which they are actually channeling people towards monoracial family formation and away from any transracial family formation. And so, I mean, I think there is a way in which a monoracial family is being reproduced through the gamete markets. The other thing that's interesting from a legal perspective is that there was recently a high-profile case, but there's other cases of this kind, a case called Kornblatt out of Ohio, in which a lesbian couple had a child through donor insemination and because of a misnumbering of the sample, had a child with a sperm donor who was African American, and they thought they were having a white child. And the court, when they bring in action, I mean, we could all agree the bank was negligent in terms of not giving them the sperm they provided, but because the injury sounded in a racial injury, the courts feel like they can't possibly, that they would be condoning an idea that they see as racist if they were to recognize a claim there. And a lot of legal scholars tend to agree with that, but I think from the perspective of what I've heard in this room, it's actually another way in which the industry escapes liability because it's seen as this exceptional thing that you can't possibly hold people responsible for.
Isn't that the case? I didn't mean to interfere.
Thank you. Just to reinforce, I've actually done some research on international IVF use and donor use. And Marcia Inhorn at Yale, you may know her, Douglas. She's Marcia Inhorn. Yeah. She's written extensively about IVF in the Middle East. And she's documented through her research that there's a distinct preference in a culture where darker skin pigmentation is associated with lower socioeconomic status, that they deliberately purchase American white eggs because they want to give their children higher status in society. And I do think that this is very problematic. I imagine that's not the only, I mean, we know, for example, that Ukrainian eggs are really popular because they're very, very pale and and if you look at how who's recruited into gamete donation, it very much conforms with racial stereotyping and culturally constructed hierarchies. And I agree that this is very, very a big issue, and it's definitely not being confronted in the industry because their job is to make money, and that's what people want to buy.
Right. And part of the issue there is internalized racism, which is a very thorny issue that we don't want to confront, but that exists.
Yes. And it's not just happening in the U.S.
Right.
Thank you guys so much. So one thing I heard a lot when you guys were speaking was talking about studying equality and equality of various groups. I think what some of you have to understand about us is that to us, imagine the women's rights movement. Imagine when women were fighting for the right to vote, and there was a panel up there telling them the philosophical reasons why women should not be allowed to vote. A panel of men who are not in the position of women. We are fighting for rights, for human rights. If you've read the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, to us, these are basic human rights that are afforded. And we've been created as a subclass of people specifically to not have rights in this regard. And it's very disturbing, extremely disturbing, in the pit of your stomach to hear the words equality from people who don't understand that that's what our struggle is about. And it's, until you're in this position, it's very, very, very hard to conceptualize. And we appreciate so much people who are willing to kind of expand their hearts, expand their minds, to put themselves in our position, because it's very difficult and it really takes a very, very special person to be able to do it. And speaking to, kind of continuing on the topic of ethnicity, I also found out that I was 50% Ashkenazi Jewish. And, because my biological father was paid $35, I was not aware of that until I was 35 years old. To me, my body, my ethnicity, the fact that I exist, we just had Holocaust Remembrance Day a couple days ago, right? So if my biological great-grandfather had not left Latvia, all his siblings were killed, my biological grandmother, all her first cousins, her aunts and uncles were killed, right? If that man didn't leave Latvia, I would not be here right now, just like many other people who have Ashkenazi Jewish descent, right? That fact, that $35 was paid, doesn't take that away from my existence. It can't take that away from my body, from why I exist. And the thought of that, of having my humanity sold away for that much money, is incomprehensible until it happens to you. And the other thing is, we spoke about this morning a little bit about giving love, love being one of those responsibilities of parenthood that could kind of be or not be delegated away. And someone asked, well, why can't it be delegated away? Why does it have to be that genetic parent giving it to you? And the answer is because we're human. It's dehumanizing to say that you can give that away. It's not human. And I think one of the misconceptions a lot of people have is that gamete provider takes away from our parents. Like, my dad will always be daddy. He's daddy. Steve is Steve. He's my biological father, but he's the man I look like. He's why everybody tells me I'm a typical Jewish person. That's why. That's why. So he is why I'm here. My dad raised me. It doesn't take away. People don't just not have children because they have parents. You don't not keep in touch with your cousins because you have siblings. Why does it have to be either or? Why do you have to transfer responsibilities? Why can't it be that everyone has a place in your life and it's recognized as important? Because we're all sitting here, NPEs are telling you, adoptees are telling you that this matters. It's important to us. Maybe not to every single one of us, but it matters enough that if you can do something about it, you can't ignore us. You can't ignore the people, just like you can't ignore women asking for the right to vote. You can't ignore gay and lesbian community who are asking for the right to marry. And you can't ignore us asking for rights, because it's not human. And we're here, and we're here for you to listen to us and understand us.
I don't want to go on this full hour. It's Saturday evening.
I have to say, okay, because I'm the psychologist in the room, when I showed up yesterday and realized how much of the audience was donor-conceived young adults, and yet we had a really academic conference, that we were attending, I thought to myself immediately, like, oh my gosh, this is so hard to listen to really interesting academic papers and academic lectures when, if intellectually, as a student, as a psychologist, I'm enthralled by what you're saying. If I was one of these donor-conceived young people, sitting here, I don't know how I could have sat here, because it's really hard to have your personal lived experience be talked about in an intellectual, academic way. And I give everyone so much credit for really trying to sit and take it in and absorb what you all have to say. And I give you guys a lot of credit for trying to, like, wow, now we suddenly didn't, I'm sure you all wanted to run home and slightly change your, what you were gonna say so that you could really speak to the crowd. And I think it really shows that the people here really wanted to have a place to come and hear, and I don't know, I just want to appreciate kind of both sides of what happened, because wow, what an amazing thing that no one came to blows, and hopefully everyone, walks away feeling a little bit like their minds were broadened and their hearts were broadened.
I think I want to say something about that, and that is, the idea was not to have a gathering of donor-conceived children. The idea was this is an ethical issue that ethicists have not been discussing. And here are 5 ethicists who want to discuss this. And we need to be discussing it. Now, it's wonderful that the donor-conceived members of the audience came, and we have learned so much from them. And I do understand that listening to our cerebral nattering about it may be difficult. But, the cerebral natterers also have some influence on what happens. And we want to do our part. So that's what I would say. Sure.
So, Connecticut. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just like to say Connecticut because that's where I'm from. So, I just wanted to know, I was conceived in Hartford, born in Tolland, raised in East Hartford, moved to Vernon, and then Jersey. Okay. My mom was from the Valley, so actually my donor-conceived brother's family was from the Valley as well. But my question to you is, did you know that this was the type of law you wanted to study before you went in, or were you planning on going into a different type of law?
I went to law school because I was interested in questions of sexuality and gender just from my own life and what I was then interested in academically, and wanting to, and this is meant as no offense to the philosophers, wanting to do something in which I felt I could also have effects in the world really concretely. And so law felt like the place to do that, and just always knew that's what I wanted to do, and I found it satisfying in ways I couldn't have imagined, but also that issues have evolved in ways that I think are more interesting and actually intersect with other questions of equality and liberty in a way that wasn't clear in 2000 when I was in law school.
So on the topic that was brought up yesterday about how to have better research on a population like this, I mean, a really great point was brought up by, I think I'm just going to refer to you as Queer Spawn Lady. I'm sorry. About things being misquoted or misattributed, and that being a problem in research. But I think that another problem is that there are almost forbidden thoughts or thought crimes that need to be confronted in order to get people to even to be honest, because even the mere idea that people could have a problem with this in any way is incredibly forbidden, right? So I'm sure that many of us have had experiences where you tell a friend about your situation and the instant thing is, well, you know, your parents just wanted you so bad. How could you insult your parents by talking about this? You're being so hurtful. You're being so insulting. And so on the issue of, I suppose, methodological constraints, because I'm also, I mean, I'm donor conceived, but I'm also trying to be an academic. I'm wondering, because this question was posed to us yesterday, what you think, how you think this could be improved, how you think that research in this population could be done better?
They have to do it. Nobody does it. I don't think we're at the point of doing it better. There's very little research done because there's not been a constituency that wants it done. I think you have to, it's now that donor-conceived children are getting older and becoming adults who can advocate for things that I think you can begin.
I want to say something that's sort of tangentially related to that, and that one of the things that I think really needs to be addressed is the way the subject is treated in the press. The press absolutely loves the reunion stories. They just love those stories. And the part they love about them is the instant connection, the amazing similarities that people find with their half-siblings. They just think this is the most wonderful thing in the world. And none of them ever reflect on the fact that, and this goes back to the comment of this young redheaded woman who said something that I thought was so important, which is that I didn't experience that reunion because I grew up with my brothers. And I know what I have in common with them. And if you're going to write a newspaper article about how amazing it is that these long-lost half-siblings have so much in common, the next thought should be, look what they were deprived of for all of these years. And so people have to start writing letters to the editor. That's all I could say. Yeah? Okay. So there were some questions back here.
Hi. So we covered the topic of donor responsibility and donor anonymity, and forgive me if I wasn't here like for all the presentations, but I was just wondering on the topic of donor status disclosure in terms of whether heterosexual parents tell their children that they were donor conceived, if there are any effective arguments in favor of not telling children they're donor conceived, and what those arguments are, if you've come across any.
I don't think there is anybody who thinks it's a good idea not to tell.
A different mic. Oh, it's on? Okay, sorry.
It is on, okay. I don't know of anybody who argues it's a good idea not to tell donor-conceived people that they are donor-conceived. I've never read any arguments that argue that that in itself is a good thing. There are arguments that say that it might not be a bad thing given other situations, but I don't know of anybody who argues it is a great thing to lie to people who are donor conceived. Again, that doesn't mean that there are no arguments for not disclosing certain information because of other contextual aspects. For example, one of the reasons why many people are reluctant to tell their children, and we do have evidence of this, is because they fear their children are going to be stigmatized and that their relationships are going to be affected. So parents make a choice to not give that information to their children, perhaps incorrectly thinking that that is going to be harmful to their families. Whether that is the case or not, again, the evidence is mixed, but I don't know of anybody who thinks that just because you shouldn't give that information.
I'm also a clinical psychologist here, and I do know from some people who work in some of the bigger medical centers where they get people traveling here from all over the world, that there is a major concern in certain cultures that knowing or other people knowing really leads to to people being ostracized. Marcia Inhorn was mentioned, and she does a lot of work around people in the Middle East. So there are some very specific situations. In this country, there is also an issue around Orthodox Jews who use assisted reproductive technologies. That being said, almost everyone would also still advocate, the mental health professionals would try to help the parents to understand what they're doing and to understand what it's going to mean to live with that kind of a secret, and maybe even to explore the difference between secrecy and privacy. But there are certain cultures in which it is really a very hard thing to be accepted.
I would just add that in our culture, there's also the issue of the threat to masculinity. Right, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, a lot of the fathers who didn't want it known that they weren't biological fathers because they were infertile, or
I want to point out, actually, I want to point out that, however, has nothing to do with anonymity. It has to do with disclosure, not anonymity.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. We're talking about disclosure.
Well, I was going to say, in that respect, I mean, children who are adopted are told from a very young age, that's what the adoption agencies say, and the 3-year-olds run around going, oh, I'm adopted, I'm adopted. They don't necessarily know what it means. But I think we're even having trouble deciding whether donor isn't the right word to use. So the question is, what is the right word to use to explain to a young child that their father was unable to do it? I mean, how do we explain that to them, especially if you're saying that you want to do it at a young age? Because once they become a teenager, it might even be more overwhelming. But I was very impressed by the lady, I don't know your name, of course, who said that it was clear to her, since she had lesbian parents, that she had to have been conceived another way, and she seems to feel that she grew up in a much more healthy psychological environment because of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, in that respect, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's certainly ways that you can talk to young kids about, just like you can talk to young kids about sex, and there's ways to talk about with young kids about sex. There are ways to talk with kids about sex and donation, or sex and sperm providers, or there's a lot of children's books. There's things that have been developed. There's gender-neutral things that have been starting to be developed. Like, there is a growing access for that, and there's a stronger and stronger argument that young children should be taught about sex. So we just need to get over it as adults.
Well, it's even like, for example, children now at age 3, 4, 5, are totally aware, like the gay community. I mean, this wasn't something when I was a kid that I was aware of, but now children are 100% on top of it. So it's really a matter of discussion and becoming available to everybody. And as it was said yesterday, the reason we don't have the research is because there's no legislation or regulation where we've been able to obtain a lot of that information. And my last thing, I'm going to let everybody else speak, is who are all these Ashkenazi Jewish guys giving all this sperm? I don't know, maybe it's the same one.
Yeah, we're a very generous group. What can I say? Okay, one more question, and then I think we should call it a day, call it a weekend.
Mine's not a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I just also want to say thank you so much. Again, this has just been such an amazing opportunity, and thank you all for coming here to speak. Okay, question. I've just been, a few different panelists have said, like, oh, well, we're really worried that biology is being overhyped and that, we're too focused on that. And I just didn't feel like I've heard a good argument given, like, what are you if not your biology? That's your body, that's your physical form, your inherited trauma, your characteristics, your brain, your mind, your medical information, your mental health. And the whole point of using sperm donation or assisted reproductive technology is to have your own biology. So to say biology doesn't matter, but to support these technologies, to me, feels a little hypocritical. So I'd like to hear, kind of in response to that, how is it that biology cannot matter, but also this technology, you can be in favor of this technology? And little mini, should I just do the one question then?
I'm happy to respond to that. I do not think that people have a right to have biologically related children. So I don't have a problem at all with, I do think that people have a right to parent, however, because I think that parenting relationships are very important to human beings. But there are all ways that we can parent. So I do not think that people have a right, and one of my worries with reproductive technologies is indeed that they try to ensure that people have genetically related children. So I don't have any inconsistencies. But I recognize, again, that people do have, if not a right, at least a very strong interest in parenting. And in many cases, they cannot do that in any other way than through these technologies. So unless we have other ways to provide for that possibility, then maybe these technologies are the way to go.
Yeah, just on the hypocritical point, I mean, I think there are different kinds of cases. So in some cases, adoption is not easy, fostering is not easy. So in some cases, people's motivations for using gamete donation is not to have a child that's biologically related to them, but because that's the only practical way that they're able to become a parent.
I just to say something, imagine what kind of world we have where it is easier to have IVF than to adopt a kid. Yeah. That says something about the kind of society that we have. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And so I'll say, so I actually, when I present my work in law professor audiences, a lot of people say, oh, well, you're being I have a colleague who says to me, you're being a coward, just get rid of biology altogether. And my response to that is not a practical one, but a principled one, which is I think biology matters, but I think it matters because we live in a world in which it matters to people. And I hear all of you saying it matters. So my argument is not that biology doesn't matter, it's that it shouldn't crowd out other things that do matter. And that the social contributions are important in ways that we discount. And so I worry about when biology gets talked about in a way that makes it more important than other things that I also think are important. And so I just think we can have a system that respects the biological connection, but also respects the other kinds of connections people are forming. And in terms of family, I think some of these social connections and living out family relationships is important in ways that we don't currently respect.
Okay, I think I'll just thank the speakers. There will be a website on which I think some of these people may post some additional information. The video of the conference will be available online. I believe it will be on the website of the New York Institute of Philosophy. However, it's going to take some months because it has to be captioned for the hearing impaired first. But I hope, I guess maybe I will use the registration list and send out an email when it becomes available so that you will be notified that it's available. Okay, thank you very much.